Hi, it's Dennis once again, and it's time for Tuesday Talks with Pastor Dennis, where I bring a message for the children of Christ Community Church. And today, I'd like to speak with you about anxious feelings. Being anxious is when we're nervous, uneasy, or worried about the unknown outcome of an event or an experience. I like to raise the question, how do we quiet our hearts when we're met with anxious experiences? There are 4 questions that I have found very helpful to help me navigate through times when I'm met with something that elicits an anxious response. But before we look at those questions, I think it's helpful to see how they nicely dovetail with a 4-point outline of the Bible. You may be familiar with this. It's known as creation, the fall, redemption, and restoration. But rather than using the words creation and the fall, I like to change them up a little bit. The first one I changed from creation to relationships, because what's going on in Genesis, where creation is revealed, is that God is setting right relationships in order. He's showing us the right relationship that man has with creation. He's showing what right relationships within marriage looks like, right relationships with others, with our work, with government, and straight on down the line it continues. Also, I like to change up the word fall with the word rebellion, because we have a tendency to kind of distance ourselves illegitimately, but we do this. It's a subtle nuance of our heart, is to distance ourselves and just place that on Adam and say that's something that Adam did. But we identify with Adam theologically. So I like to use the word rebellion because that's something I'm familiar with. That's something that rests right here. So we have relationships, rebellion, redemption, and restoration. And the first question that dovetails with those is going to dovetail with the very first point, and that's relationships. It's found in Job 38, where God raises the question, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? And he presents it to Job. Now, up to this point, Job has been suffering and wrestling with life's questions all throughout this book. And he raises a number of questions themselves. And in the midst of suffering, he raises one of the most common questions. You may have guessed it. It's the question, why? And here's what's going on in our lives when we wrestle with suffering or challenging situations, and we just don't like the unsettling outcome as we see it at that point. Here, God is in the position of authority over us, and the subtleness of our heart as we start to raise more questions, we express to God, God, I don't like this. This is not what I had intended. Pain and suffering was not part of my plans, my goals, my desires. Why, God? Why is this happening? And subtly, we're saying to God, God, you answer to me. I'm in control. Well, how does God respond to Job in the midst of all this suffering? He's very gracious and he's very patient. He pummels Job with over 40 questions. And here's what he's doing, subtly, graciously, and patiently. He's saying, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Where were you when I drew the line in the sand and said to the waters, thus far and no further? He's reorienting the right relationship of Job being in subjection to the Creator who has from eternity past ruled over all. That first question, in part, is to help lift our eyes off the anxiousness of the uncertainty of the unknown outcome and center it on the sovereignty of God, who has from eternity past shown himself repeatedly to be faithful, and he governs over all. It starts with that first question. Where were we when he laid the foundations of the world? Let's reflect on that the next time we find ourselves being anxious. Next week, we'll look at the second question. and see how we move from setting things in the right relationship to how do we deal with rebellion that rests within our heart. Until then, peace, and be still and know that He is God.